Good evening, class. I thought I'd do a brief week 12 lecture video on the play, the drama by Susan Gaspell called Trifles. So we're going to talk a little bit about Trifles here momentarily. We're going to look at that discussion question and we'll probably look at the research paper stuff. And keep in mind, week 12 modular sort of opened up. It was talking about a doll's house. The truffles or the trifles play is really it should be really short compared to Aspen's play. So I would go ahead when you get a shot and get a chance to go ahead and start reading some of that next play that we're going to be looking at really for next week. But you can go ahead and start because that's really what's on the list for this week as it relates to the reading. So let me turn this off and I will sort of talk to you a little bit about um, the play that we have. So in a lot of ways, when we look at Trifles, we got to understand that Trifles is a feminist play. A lot of you probably know that just by the language that they use. Um, it presents a beautiful picture of the world of a domesticated women in a patriarchal society. So that's one thing that you kind of, have to keep in mind about. Um, some of the other things, the play questions existing laws and justice by foregrounding female identity and perspective. The play begins, right, in the now abandoned farmhouse of John and Minnie Wright. So we're at the Wright farmhouse. At, at the instance of Mr. Henderson, the county attorney, Mr. Hale, a neighboring farmer, recounts his visit to the house the previous day. Right? He found Mrs. Wright behaving strangely. The husband lay dead upstairs with a rope around his neck. Mr. Hale says that when he questioned her, Mr. Wright claimed, or Mrs. Wright claimed that she was asleep when someone strangled her husband. Right? But we know as we read through the drama, that's not the case. While the three men are searching the house for evidence, Mr. Hale and Mrs. Peters, the sheriff's wives, do it on their own. The women discover clues to the couple's personalities as well as evidence in the case. They realize that Mr. Wright killed his wife's pet bird, right? And that led to Mrs. Wright killing her husband. So the bird was sort of Mrs. Wright's way of, it's metaphorical in a lot of ways. The bird was in the cage. It was trying to sing. It chirped. It made noise, sort of as an artistic expression, try to express itself. The house, in a lot of ways, was the sort of the cage that kept Mrs. Wright sort of in check. She couldn't really venture out. She couldn't go with her friends. She couldn't really do too much of anything. So in a lot of ways, the bird and Mrs. Wright are symbolic of each other. The men found no evidence upstairs that proved Mrs. Wright was guilty, right? However, the wives understand that Mrs. Wright was a victim of abuse by her husband. Again, it all depends on how you read it. Is there some physical evidence there that we know? I mean, we don't really see, she doesn't talk anything about being abused as it relates to being beaten up and that type stuff. But, there's different types of abuse. There's mental abuse, which would play a part of psychological abuse. Of course, you do have the physical abuse. You have emotional abuse. Again, that probably fit into the mental and psychological. After the women discover the truth, they hide the dead bird. Of course, they don't want her friend or their friend to get in trouble, so to speak. They know that would otherwise be used to make the case against Mrs. Wright. Yes, it probably would. They stand by the side of Mrs. Wright and justify the murder. Now, again, that's the question. Um, was it right for them to stand by their friend and justify this murder of her husband? Again, as a feminist play, Trifles presents women displaying brilliant skills of observation and deduction. It highlights female identity and perspective and questions the current law and justice. So again, we have this particular play that's questioning those things. Um, when we look again, and I'm going to bring something over here just so we can have it, sort of the themes and stuff that the play actually really goes over and sort of discuss, right? Um, Obviously, a feminist perspective, the play highlights female identity and perspective in a male dominant society, basically. And that's where we get here when we see how is patriarchal dominance reflected in Henderson's opinion of Mrs. Wright's kitchen. Henderson is the county attorney who probes the death of Mr. John Wright. Although with Henry Peters, the sheriff, he goes upstairs to investigate the case. He says Mrs. Wright's kitchen is a mess. Of course, it probably would be, right? Something just evil has happened in the house. He blames the dirty towels in the kitchen. He calls her a bad housekeeper. It is a patriotic line of men to blame women for everything as if man has no role in keeping the home in order. When Mrs. Hale tries to defend Mrs. Wright, Henderson says that she is trying to be loyal to her sex. So again, we have this during the time this was written, the men sort of sticking to the sort of the dominant male beliefs of the time, and the women sort of trying to stick together to their own um, sort of rules and laws at the time. Which that brings in a lot of questions when we get into A Doll's House. You're going to see a lot of this stuff sort of pop up and that play with some of those characters, which gets back to a couple more of these motifs and tropes that we see. Law and justice, it questions existing notions of law and justice through women's experience. We have this character analysis, right? Insights into the characters of Mrs. Wright, Mrs. Hale, and Mrs. Peters, and their roles in this particular narrative, right? Um, some other questions that we could, ponder here. Do you think that what Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters have done in the name of justice was right? And if so, why? So that's something that we have to kind of think about. Um, do you think it was right that what they did, right, as far as hiding the evidence, so to speak, with the bird, to try to protect their own in some ways, not only just their friend and neighbor, but also their own as it relates to the gender of female, of their own sex, that of being a woman. So when we look, one answer to that question is Mr. Hale is the wife of a neighboring farmer, and Mrs. Peter is the wife of Henry Peters, the sheriff, investigating the death of Mr. Wright. They would have helped the law to bring a crime to light. Mrs. Peters should have assisted her husband in this case. However, both of them favor Mrs. Wright. Mrs. Peters puts the box, which is clear evidence, into her coat pocket to hide it from the eyes of her husband as well as Mr. Henderson, the attorney. The deeds of the two ladies are technically by law wrong. So in a lot of ways, that's the dilemma. Put yourself sort of maybe in their shoes, put yourself sort of maybe in the shoes of those that are seemingly male dominating of society during that time. If you look at this is a particular quote. It's all just a different kind of the same thing. How does Glaspell present female experiences in the play? Well, Trifles talk about domesticated womanhood in a patriotic society. Minnie Foster is a good lady by birth and nurture. Fortunately, she was married to John Wright, a male chauvinist. Minnie had a pet canary, but John Wright didn't like the bird, so he killed her pet. In revenge, Mrs. Wright killed him, strangling him by the neck with a rope. The play talks about the male attitude towards women, looking down upon the women folk as trifle is common in society. It's all just a different kind of the same thing. So yes, you have a lot of different role reversals here, which gets to the point that we have here, right? Examination of how patriarchal attitudes affect the perception of women's roles and contributions. Symbolism, we have the significance of objects like the dead bird and the kitchen as symbols of women's lives and struggles, right? They were pretty much um, at home most of the time. They were housekeepers. A lot of times, their role in this particular society was to keep the house clean, to cook dinner, to cook the meals, to wash the clothes, and to bear children and to raise the children, which we will see a lot of that in the A Doll's House drama that we're reading here soon. Um, a lot of times the question comes up, explain the significance of the title Trifles. The title Trifles is very significant. The trifles that the men laugh at are important keys to solving the crime. Ironically, they are not trifles at all. Those trifles would have led them to solve the crime had they paid attention to them. Miss Hale and Miss Peters know what a woman's life is like. Why? Well, because they're living that life of a woman currently in the play. Thus, they are able to reconstruct how and why Mrs. Wright killed her husband. So, in a lot of ways, the women of this play are a lot better detectives than the county sheriff and the attorney that have shown up. The title points to a main theme of the play, that men are blinded by their own arrogance when they refuse to take the details of women's lives seriously, which we see a lot of that happening even today in the 21st century. You're thinking 18th, 19th century when this stuff was written. Some things have changed, have improved as it relates to women, and then some things have sort of stayed the same. Um, I mean, think about, for the females, for the women in the course, what maybe your grandmother went through compared to what your mothers went through and maybe still going through compared to what you're going through now. A lot of things have, improved for women, but some things have still kind of stayed the same. Um, One thing is this, when we look at this word queer, right, there's a lot of different meanings to that. Obviously, we know a lot of different ones, both formal and informal. But as it relates to this particular play, what does Mr. Hale mean by that word? And Mr. Hale was attending the attitude of Mrs. Wright when he visited him. Um, he found her behaving strangely, behaving sort of queer, right? Different way to see that word back during that time. She was acting weird. There was something off about her, which gets more into this moral dilemmas that we see. Discussion of the ethical implications of Mrs. Hale, Mrs. Peters, actions concerning justice. We have this social commentary, critique of the societal norms, and trivializing women's experiences. Um, we see a lot of this go on with this particular play. What did Mrs. Wright do when she knew that Mr. Hill had gone for the coroner? Well, she stood up from the rocking chair and moved on to another nearby chair. She sat there looking down, head lowered, and palms twisted together. So again, that's sort of her acting, out of her nature, out of her character, acting queer, acting strangely. She knew at some point they would probably discover what was going on. Um, and that's why she was acting the way she was acting. She couldn't really hide it, and maybe she didn't want to hide it. It's not like she ran away from her house and was like a fugitive on, on the run. Um, some other questions to sort of look at, right? What was Mrs. Wright's response when Mr. Hill wanted to see John? Mr. Wright told Mr. Hill that he could not see John because he was dead. So she basically came out and said he was dead. And then she pointed to where he was at, right? Upstairs. Some interesting thing with Mrs. Hale, though, right? Why did Mrs. Hale put her hand on her nose while opening the fancy box? When she opened the box, she noticed something in it wrapped in a silk clothing. When she opened it, she came to know that it was Mrs. Wright's pet canary. Someone had strangled its neck and killed the bird. So notice how, the neck was strangled or broken. Compare that to how her husband died, right? He was sort of strangled with the rope too, possibly had his neck broken in a similar manner. How does Mrs. Hale remember Minnie Foster, right? Minnie Foster was Mrs. Wright's maiden name before marriage. She was a beautiful and good natured woman, nice and full of vulgar. Um, she used to sing in a melancholy, really beautiful, not necessarily always sad, but voice in a church choir wearing beautiful clothes. So that was before she became married, right? Um, marriage sort of took the toll on her life, and not necessarily in a good way. And it could be because how her husband John um, treated her throughout the marriage. If you look again at this, explain how Mrs. Peters managed the box before the return of Peters opening it. And we'll come to this here momentarily because it sort of blends into some of these tropes and motifs that we're seeing over here. Um, if we look at, when Peters and Henderson returns, Mrs. Peters realized that this dead bird was going to be the pointer in the murder, right? It's the sort of the red flag. It was the evidence that was sort of going to seal the deal for her, really. She knew that it might cause harm to the poor lady, Mrs. Wright, so she tried to hide it in her purse first, as it did not fit in really because it was a big box. So she put the box in her coat pocket. Again, hiding, tampering with evidence. Uh, what is the implication of the dead canary in Mrs. Wright's sewing basket? It indicates that John Wright had wrung the canary's neck to death, which we know that by now if you read the play, as the canary was her sole companion. She took revenge by killing her husband with a rope around his neck. So this bird was really her only friend in the house, and basically became the only friend that she had during the marriage, because she couldn't really leave. She didn't really venture out as much. Um, John did all the walking and everything outside the house. She was sort of that homemaker that had to stay in. So you have to kind of keep in mind during that time it had to be frustrating because I mean think of the times now that females, women in general can get up. If they have a car, they can go out and drive around town. They can walk around. They don't have to be confined in this cage or this prison called a home. They can do other things on their own these days. And that's one thing that sort of has changed. You don't have to always be in the presence of a male figure, being a brother, father, or a husband, like you did during some of these times when these writers were, especially these females writers, were doing these plays. Does Henderson's belief, a sheriff's wife, and we will come back, as it talks a little bit about the sheriff's wife here momentarily, but that's belief of the sheriff's wife, right? Um, if we look and really analyze this question, um, does Henderson's belief a sheriff's wife is married to the law help him in his investigation? And of course, we can come to the conclusion, no, that it does not. Mrs. Peters understands that Mrs. Wright was a victim of abuse by her husband, so she hides the dead bird. She knows that it would be used against Mrs. Wright. She allies herself with Mrs. Wright and justifies the murder. So we get to this point too. Why did Mrs. Hale feel sorry for Mrs. Wright? Well, Mr. Wright was not an ideal husband for Mrs. Wright. Her life with him was hell. Before marriage, she was always pleasant and smiling. She should have had a life partner better than Mr. John Wright, is the conclusion that we get here. If we look at sort of wrapping this up here, because again, this is really a relatively short drama. One thing that we can kind of look at is, how does Glaspell criticize the essentialist patriarchal notion meant to demean women? Well, again, in the play Trifles, the menfolk look down on the women. The women's works are belittled and trivialized. Mr. Hell says, well, women are used to worrying about trifles. He forgets that it is these trifles that give the clues for important findings in the story. George Harrison, the attorney, Henry Peterson, the sheriff, are investigating the murders of John Wright. There are many evidences in the house that lead the investigators to the murder. The rocking chair, the birdcage, the quilt, the pretty box with the dead bird in it, and the piece of silk are solid pieces of evidence that we know. But the high-headed patriotical men never heed any of these and treat them at all as trifles. But the ladies know their value. Not concentrating on the real investigation, Henderson and the team find time to criticize and belittle the women. They criticize Mrs. Wright's incapacity to be a good housekeeper. Henderson displays the patriarchal tendencies to blame women for not keeping the house tidy, as if a man has no role in it. He finds fault with the dirty towels and blames her wrong homemaking instincts. Trivializing and demeaning the work of women is common in our society. The play should be read with an ideal of time when women were treated inferior to men naturally, intellectually, and morally. So that's one way that Glaspell is actually criticizing how things are going in this particular play. And that's really the social commentary that we should take away from this particular aspect of the play as well. So moving along here and looking at different things, this is sort of the discussion post that I moved, right? It was supposed to be due this past Sunday, but I realized that the SA2 and everything was sort of closed up. And again, I kind of apologize for that. The storms, Helene and Milton, Helene mostly, sort of screwed a lot of us up, with property, with things at our own house. But it also sort of screwed up things with our semester, having to move deadlines and that type of stuff. So I apologize if that sort of jammed everybody up. I looked at the schedule, realized we do have a little bit of time. That's why I was able to move some stuff around, modify the schedule a little bit to benefit everybody involved, right? I'm still working on grading some of the SA2s. The ones I have graded have been fairly good, fairly decent, given with everything going on in the month of October. There was a lot of times I was trying to do lecture videos on some of the poems, and of course the storms came that knocked us out a little bit. I was trying to get stuff on my end done with this Blackboard Ultra that they're going to introduce to everybody, faculty and staff wise, in the spring. So that was sort of preoccupying my time a little bit. And then I had my other classes too with essays and stuff coming in. So I kind of apologize for that part of it. But there was really no way, we couldn't stop Mother Nature when it came to the storms. We just had to do the best we could and move forth. And I think we've all sort of adjusted to that. I think everybody, for the most part, is starting to get back to normal prior to the storms, right? Having power, having internet, that type stuff, which is good. If you look, though, this is the particular discussion topic. There's really only one question, and I'm basically focusing on gender roles and language in the play. The initial question is the women's language is essential in the play. See how the men react to it. How do you feel about the gender roles shown through language in this play? So they use a lot of different language, diction, words. We looked at one word, queer, here earlier. So that's what I'm looking, really looking at. If you look here, I give you some instructions, right? You might want to reread the play again. If you sort of skim through it the first time, you might want to give it another rereading. A lot of times with these plays, especially like with poetry that we just got finished with, you really needed to read the poem probably multiple times. With some of these plays and certain sections, you may have to go back and revisit certain areas multiple times to really get the full meaning. One full read through probably isn't enough, honestly. So that's why you want to sort of manage your time wisely, that you're able to not only stay kept up with the reading each week, but also be able to tackle some of these discussion post questions and stuff, and ultimately get ready to start drafting the research paper and finalizing that. You might see this up here, final exam. I was thinking about possibly doing another essay, a really short essay, 2 to 3 pages, being it more comprehensive, meaning covering the whole scope of the course. I may rethink that a little bit and just focus on the two plays. So I probably won't really talk so much about the final exam during this video, but once I really figure out whether I'm going to stick with the 2 to 3 page essay deal for it, or do something more or less with Trifles and the Dollhouse, I will let you know probably in the next video. May do something like a true false type exam, but I'll let you know. If we continue to look at the instructions of the discussion post, right? You want to craft your response. Your post should be about 250 words, which really, if you do the double space and that type stuff, that would be about one full type page. Now, what I would probably suggest that you do, you could probably go ahead and type out your response in Microsoft Word, because then you have the benefit of using the spell and grammar check, edit, and proofread before uploading the one that you want everybody to read. You can sort of copy and paste from Word into the text box that they provide. Or if you find that your particular response is getting a little bit lengthy, going beyond 250 words, then you might want to just save it as a Microsoft Word document, right? Follow the standard Microsoft Word MLA9 format and just upload your initial response. You want to address how gender roles are portrayed through language in the play. That's part of the question. Reflect on how men react to women's language. Do they dismiss, misunderstand, or ignore what the women say? We see a lot of that. We talked a little bit about that here momentarily, how some of the men really treat the items that the women have as trifles, and really dismiss a lot of the verbal reaction from the women in the play. How does this reflect societal expectations of gender roles? You want to provide specific examples from the text to support your argument. I think a lot of times when I do these discussion posts, a lot of the responses, though most of them are pretty good and pretty on point, what they lack is textual evidence, right? Quotations from the actual play or the poem or the story that we're reading at that time. They sort of just give me a surface response that reads more like a Wikipedia response or a Spark Notes response. They don't really dig into the text and pull stuff out to use, right, to back up their main points, to back up their opinion or suggestions, or to really back up the thesis statement when we get into a bigger type genre writing, like an essay, right, with essay one or essay two that we just finished, or the upcoming research paper. So you really want to go through these texts, these poems, and find quotations that's going to really support your point, and pull those out and analyze those and blend those into your writing to make your writing really flow and really get to the meat and potatoes of whatever you're trying to argue. Um, when you respond to a peer or a classmate, because this is going to be one of those, you're going to have to initially submit your post, but then you're going to have to go back and pick somebody's response and sort of critique it. So we hopefully we know the etiquette about discussion, at least online. Be respectful and thoughtful, and engagement is required for the discussion. I mean, don't get on there and say, well, your response is stupid, or call somebody dumb or whatever. We can agree to disagree in a constructive, professional, and respectful manner. And that's what we need to do. If I start seeing, start reading people, really dogging or downing a particular post or a person, then we're going to stop it. I'm going to, you're going to lose points for that, obviously, because you're not being respectful. Um, and there's no reason for it. We're all in this sort of together. We all have our own opinions. That's when, bringing stuff out of the text and quoting it and using it mindfully in your writing will support your points. And that's why when the reader comes in, they can see that and say, oh yeah, this is a different perspective than mine, and may not necessarily agree with it with 100%, but I see where you're getting, I see where you're trying to go. So in some ways, your writing could be persuasive. It can be, convincing depending on the quotes and stuff that you're using, but you don't necessarily have to be nasty and ugly. There's a lot of that already out there on social media. We're not trying to turn this discussion post into a Facebook, troll page. Um, you want to avoid generalizations about gender, both male and female. Focus on the play's context and how the playwright, in this case, Glaspell, uses language to heighten gender dynamics. Peer responses. So when you go back to respond to a peer, after posting your response, you must comment on at least one classmate's post. You can do more if you want. I'm only looking at, did you upload yours and did you respond to somebody else's? If you did that, then that's half of the grade right there, right? That's about 50% of your grade. The other 50% is going to come into how well you really analyzed, how well you gave, constructive responses, that type stuff. Your comment for your peer should be about 100 words, adding new insight, questioning assumptions, or engaging in a thoughtful discussion. So again, in some ways, you're picking apart your peer's response. Again, constructively, don't have to be nasty about it. Try to be positive where you can be positive, neutral where you can be neutral. You don't necessarily want to be highly negative on it, but you can be critical in a constructive fashion. And the reason why we're doing this sort of exercise is that this should be getting you ready for your research paper. When you look at some of those topics over the two dramas, we will look at those here momentarily. You're going to have to go out and get critical sources, right? Secondary research material that's academic in nature. You're going to read critics that are going against other critics. And in some ways, we're doing a preview of that with these discussions to sort of get you ready for you to be able to do that when you start reading your sources, pulling stuff out, to be able to argue for or against a particular notion or side when it comes to some of these works. If you look, I sort of give you some grading criteria to look at, right? Relevance to the prompt, textual evidence and analysis, clarity and organization. So 10, 10, 5, engagement with classmates, 5, grammar, MLA format, 5. So 35 points right now is the highest, right? 35 out of 35 would be 100. And I sort of break that down. You can kind of use your own calculator to see how that works. 34 over 35 is a 97, so on and so forth. Um, so that's what we're looking for. So when you click on this, as you can tell, we already have some folks that have already started. I will probably go back and kind of look at these two and give sort of my critique, my criticism. Um, I will probably, as it says here, has one. This is basically telling me that this person's only uploaded their own. They haven't really responded to anybody else. This one has 2, so I'll go back and look at that to see if they actually respond to somebody else. When I see there's more than one, meaning you responded to somebody else and you uploaded yours, that's when I'm going to probably start the grading process. But I'm trying to get SAT sort of graded as well. But I will be popping in and looking at some of these as it relates to me joining into the discussion. I may not be able to join into everybody's discussion, so I'm sort of hoping that other folks, not everybody's doing all one person, they are actually spreading out and everybody's sort of getting a post on their particular page as well. But you may have to create a thread to get started. So if you look here, I'm going to look at Captain and see we have a Microsoft Word that will work. But when you come back into reply to his, you might want to either hit reply. That's probably the best thing to do. And then when you hit reply, it's going to drop down this box. And this is what I was talking about. You can use Microsoft Word to, type out your reply so you can have the spell check and the grammar check and then paste that back into here. Now, I realize, this is going to be a little bit difficult if you're typing in this particular message box to try to fit everything, via MLA format. Do the best you can. That you can follow the MLA format with quotations. Go back and look, and I will show you where you can find that, how to quote drama and play. Because there's a certain way how you want to quote plays and dramas when you're doing in-textual or parenthetical citation. Don't forget about the works cited, or in this case, it'd probably just be work cited, not works, because you're only using the one play. But be mindful of that because you can control the in-text citation and the works cited page. You may not be able to control so much the header, the double spacing, and that type stuff, unless you're uploading. If you're initially uploading your work as a doc file, you can control it there because you are using Microsoft Word. But that's how you would, approach these discussion boards. And you're going to have one for a doll's house too, which I did push that deadline back to about a week just to give you enough time because that play is a little bit longer. It's 3 acts really compared to what you had to read here with Glaspell. If you look, you can find additional notes. There's a video here. It's about 30 minutes. It's a little lengthy, but again, if you need additional information, I would definitely watch the video. This is what I was talking about citing drama. I would definitely look at this and read how you cite drama. I mean, I know they're using Shakespeare, a lot of Shakespeare's work here for reference, but we get here, this is some stuff from A Doll's House. So just because they're showing Shakespeare doesn't mean Shakespeare was a play, as he wrote a lot of plays. So you would still sort of format, in text or parenthetical citation the same way. And it also shows you how to sort of set up the works cited page. Of course, you can use a works cited generator for that. Just make sure it's an MLA 9 formatted works cited generator. So you're not, doing stuff in MLA 8 and that type deal. Make sure that the titles of dramas are generally italicized. Remember, with poetry, you usually put poetry and songs in quotation marks as relates to the titles. Novels, film, dramas are generally italicized. Short stories are generally in inside quotation marks as well. So sort of keep that in mind when you're writing about these things. And when we look at the research paper, I'll bring this up here. And bring this over. So since we were only dealing with 2 dramas this time around, this is sort of the guidelines. We're focusing on A Doll's House and Trifles, right? That's the only 2 dramas that we're really reading because of time and everything, the way these storms kind of impacted our semester early on. So you need to use MLA 9 format, of course, double space, Times New Roman 12 font. The whole setup for it hasn't changed. We're using the same format. The length needs to be 7 to 10 pages or 1750 to 2500 words. And you need to at least use 8 scholarly sources plus 2 primary sources. Now, the primary sources would be the plays themselves, A Dollhouse, Trifles, or, there's going to be an opportunity where I believe it's week 13, you're going to see versions of these 2 dramas sort of played out, right? Plays, films. You can also kind of use those as well. And then a works cited page. Now, the works cited page doesn't really count as a page or go toward the word count. So if you end on page 6, technically when you start page 7, it will be your works cited page, but technically you only have a 6-page paper. So you're really short by 1 page. So you really need to try to get 7 to 10 pages or 1,750 words to 2,500 words. This research paper is going to be due on December 4th, which is a Wednesday, by 11:59. You really need to turn this stuff in on time, because after that, the following week is there's only 2 days really for final exams. Our final exam, because we're an online course, is probably going to be due a little bit sooner. It may be due on December 8th. I may have it due on the 9th. But the problem with all of this is I need to have time to grade not only this class, but 4 other classes that are doing final exams and research papers, and having them turn in about the same time you're turning yours in. And they're going to want final grades from everybody in the college, that is, by the end of business, which is by 6 o'clock in the evening on Wednesday, December 11th. So you really need to turn stuff in or by the deadlines from here on out, because I really don't have time to be hunting down grown adults, wondering why you didn't submit stuff on time when you did have a checklist that told you what was due, when it was due, on your course syllabus, and it's been on your course syllabus ever since week 1, unless I make a change, either by email or tell you in the video or both. So the purpose really of this research paper is to conduct a detailed analysis of the plays A Dollhouse by Ibsen and Trifles by Glaspell, focus on themes related to gender dynamics, societal impacts, and literary analysis. Your paper should be thoroughly understand the plays and incorporate social or scholarly research to support your analysis. Also, you want to pick quotes from the actual primary text, which again are the plays. So as you're reading these, you may want to highlight or pick out certain quotes, certain passages that you either want to directly quote or paraphrase or summarize, so you can have those as your resources that you're using to back up main points in your thesis statement throughout your research paper. So in a lot of ways, you have a month's time, basically, because today's the 5th. The instructions for these have been up here for about a week or so. So if you were ahead with SA2 and went ahead and started with week 11 and week 12, that type stuff, then you've actually had a little bit longer. Even though we haven't gotten to a doll's house yet, but that's really for this week's uh, main reading. Um, and I give you 6 topics here to choose from. As it relates to your scholarly sources, you're probably going to need to go to the college library, a public library. If you're a dual enrollment student, you should have a library that has Galileo and databases and stuff. If you looked at some of the slideshows, library orientation, some of the videos that will that sort of deal with the college library, how to check out books, how to find journal articles, that type stuff, that will give you some good indication of where, how to find good scholarly sources. Um, when I say 8, I really mean 8 sources. You need to have 8 scholarly sources. This will help you get to the 7 to 10 pages if you're really using these sources. And that's the other thing I suggest. While you go out and get these sources, you might want to highlight and select passages and quotations that you want to use from these particular sources to help you throughout your research paper. You will find as you go through the weeks here, I will give you a model paper. It's an A quality paper that a student has created while they took this particular course. So I would definitely, we will probably look at that and discuss that a little bit more, but you can always, once that opens up and you're able to look at it, that will give you sort of this suggestion of how your paper, even though the topic's probably going to be different, but it's going to show you how your paper should be organized, styled, how to, incorporate your secondary sources, those 8 scholarly sources and primary sources throughout your paper. But these are the 6 topics. You just want to pick one to write about. Now, as it relates to the 8 scholarly sources, you probably want to get you want to get a variety, maybe 2 books, 2 journal articles, 2 internet websites, and then you can find 2 additional more, other maybe a YouTube video, a podcast, or you can kind of double up. You just want to make sure that it is academic in nature, that you're just not pulling it off Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not a scholarly source, because anybody that knows how to type can get on there and add stuff and edit stuff, and we just don't know what the credentials are and who they are, so anybody can get on there and say stuff. The same sort of rule applies to some of these literary analysis sites, like Spark Notes, Cliff Notes, anything like that. Super summaries. There's a lot out there. If you can find them online, I can find them too. They claim that graduate students write them, or other faculty members or professors write them, and that could be true on some of it. Some of it could be bogus. Could be just a bunch of bunk and junk. They can be really good as it relates to a surface reading, meaning if you read something, you don't really understand it, you want to go to those particular sites to sort of get a little bit better clarification. But as far as using them, because I've seen some folks, they wanted to use Spark Notes and Lip Notes and all these other different Cliff Notes stuff in their fiction paper and in their poetry paper, and they're really not scholarly in nature as it relates to what we need to be doing, as it relates to critical and analytical thinking and using critical and analytical true academic sources. So, I mean, if you plan on kind of using those, I would really try not to use those in your paper. Because if you do, then you're going to have to find additional sources to support, because Wikipedia and Cliff Notes is not going to count as one of your for two sources, so to speak. So in a lot of ways, if you're using those, then you may have to find a total of 10 sources overall. So don't overwork yourself when it comes to this paper. If you do a little bit each day, If you work ahead a little bit each day, uh, it will make your life, I hope, not as stressful as it gets closer to December 4th, which is basically about a month from now. As you're working through your research paper, if you want to send me drafts, please do so. I'd rather, put comments and suggestions on your paper now that will help you get the better grade at the end than if you didn't send me a draft at all and just turned something in and it was just a complete mess. Because the research paper is going to be a really big chunk of your grade, to the point that it could drop you down a letter grade or two, depending on how poorly. Hopefully nobody does really bad on it. But at the same time, it can be a rewarding process that will help your grade toward the end, especially if you're borderline between a C and a B or a B and an A or that type deal. Um, so you can, send me drafts. You can send tutor.com drafts as we get closer. I would, get a good bit of your paper done to the point where you can start, because I mean, if you just send me like a half a page, I mean, that's just a half a page. And the same thing with, if you send a half a page to tutor.com, because you can want to be careful. I think they only give students like 10 hours free. So you don't want to exhaust those 10 hours just on a half a page here and a half a page there. I would say I would try to get a good completed draft, the 7 to 10 pages done before you start sending rough drafts to me and tutor.com. And I would probably, really send a draft to tutor.com and send a draft to me about the same time. Because that way one of us will get back to you sooner rather than later, and you can go ahead and start working on one particular aspect of the draft. And when the other person sends their draft, you can sort of kind of compare and take notes on, okay, let's change this. Let's maybe modify that. That way you would have two people looking at your paper. Um, if time allows, and I don't know if it will, just because of how Thanksgiving falls and everything, we could have like a little informal peer review session where you upload your paper sort of like to a discussion board, and a peer will also upload their paper, and y'all can sort of exchange papers and look at it that way. That would be another set of eyes, a third person, so to speak, looking at your work. Really, the more eyes that look at your work, the better. So even people outside of the class, if they're really good with, reading and picking out errors and with research papers, I would kind of lean on them. I wouldn't wait, until December 2nd to start sending us drafts, just because it's, 48 hours out before the final one's in. And, if I get 25 drafts from this class and 20 drafts from another class, I'm not going to be able to have time in 2 days at that point to give everybody really good constructive feedback. So, have a little bit of mercy on tutor.com and on myself when it comes to this. The earlier, the better, obviously. Um, I know some folks were probably, and this is what I kind of had to do when I was going to grad school and undergrad. A lot of times when we had these lengthy breaks like Thanksgiving break or spring break, even though it was a time to sort of regroup and to get your head back in the game, a lot of times I had to spend my breaks writing these papers just because that's the only time I had the time to do it. Um, which gets me, if you don't really want to do anything as it relates to this class during Thanksgiving break. Now, again, that could be the only time you really have time to work, depending on if people are coming to you or if you're going to travel, whatever the case may be. I would say have a good bit of your rough draft slash maybe final draft done of your paper before the 28th of November, which is Thanksgiving. That way, when we come back, basically technically on December 2nd, you would only have those those 2 days to really modify and polish whatever you need to polish. You won't be sitting there trying to finish a rough draft to get ready for a final draft, which is always usually when I see a lot of folks plagiarizing or using AI or whatever the case, it's usually during the research aspect of the course because they wait. It's they're smart enough to do the stuff, but they let procrastination and let outside sources, whether it's going to this party or that party as we're getting closer to the holidays, um, sort of dictate their time, and their management when it comes to time management is just so all over the place and disjointed that by the time they realize, oh, it's December 2nd, I got to turn this thing in by the 4th and then get ready for a final exam the following week, they start freaking out, panicking. And that's when they start, wanting to plagiarize a paper, buy a paper, use AI for the paper, and all that stuff. I mean, when you run it through these checkers, I'm going to find out. I mean, with this last paper, the poetry essay, I did find somebody that plagiarized and they got a 0 on it. So the first offense will always be a 0. The second offense, if you are foolish enough to do it a second time, which usually the first 0 shows that it's going to bring you down probably 2 letter grades, 20 points, if not more, depending on the weight of the paper. But if you do it a second time, then you automatically fail the course, and now we have to go before a panel of people, vice president, president, that type deal, and then they really determine whether they suspend you for a semester or two, or they just bar you from this college to begin with. And that stuff sticks on your transcript. You can't really get rid of it. Um, I mean, you can try to go transfer somewhere else. At some point, they're going to call the college that you left. They're going to have to get the transcript. They're going to see that you failed the class because you plagiarized the paper or you used AI. You did it more than once, and then they may not want to accept you because their college has a reputation too. They don't want people that's going to go in there and buy papers and plagiarize and use AI to do their work. Um, so that's why I say if you take a little bit each day working on the research paper, you will be done um, in time to send drafts if you wanted to, especially if your goal is, hey, I want to get all this stuff wrapped up as it relates to a rough draft by the 28th of November. I mean, you got what? 1, 2, 3. If you count this week, you got nearly 3.5, 4 weeks. Um, Probably what I would suggest is after you read both plays, Trifles and A Dollhouse, which would be, technically you should have read Trifles last week, but I know some of y'all were probably waiting last minute to write the paper, the poetry essay. So you may be behind a little bit on the reading. Again, Trifles is one of the plays. That's why I started with it. It's not really a lengthy play like a Shakespearean play or something of that nature. A Dollhouse is a little bit longer, but it's still, I mean, it's only 3 acts. It's not 5. Um, if you can get the reading that you need to do for each week down, you can, finalize posting your discussion post. I would say, really, if not by the end of this week, definitely the start of next, which if you look, Sunday's usually the start of our week, but a lot of folks probably wait until the Monday, which that's fine. I would say the week of the 11th, which is next week, I would go ahead and take the time to find the 8 sources that you're planning on going to use. Now, again, that's going to be on you. You're going to have to do the legwork going to the libraries. You're going to have to do the searching as it relates to finding scholarly work online. You're going to have to, check that stuff out or print it out or save it, whatever you have to do so you can keep up with it. But it's going to be, additional reading you're going to have to do on top of the reading that we already have in the class. So some of y'all can read really good and comprehend and retain a lot of stuff. Sometimes, some folks are maybe slower readers than others. So you're going to have to kind of, build in the time to read this stuff, to take the notes on your sources, to take the notes on the plays, you know, grab whatever quotations that you're planning on using from your sources and your plays so that will help you write the paper. So I would really say by the time we get to the 17th of November, which really, if you look, that's not this Sunday, but next. So about 2 Sundays, you should already have a paper topic in mind because by then you should have already read both plays and answered the discussion post for both of them. So you already kind of know what's going on in both. You should already have a topic 1 through 6, pick one. And I would say by the time we get to the 17th, you should already have all 8 sources and have already read through most of them and picked the stuff that you plan on using out of them. So that would give you from the 18th to the 28th, if you're using that as a sort of guidance to really do a rough draft. And let's say you wanted to do a 10-page paper. You can start writing page 1 on the 18th, page 2 on the 19th, 3 on the 20th, 4 on the 21st, 5 on the 22nd, 6 on the 23rd, 7 on the 24th, 8 on the 25th, 9 on the 26th, and then 10 on the 27th. So by the time, you're actually ahead a day. If your plan was only to do 7 pages, of course, you have a little bit more time. But you can, if you started on the 18th, that would give you enough time to get a rough draft of your research paper if you have everything that you needed for it and read everything that you needed for it. You could start sending me a draft, starting on the 27th, if not earlier. And then I can, probably give you something back over the weekend, the 29th, the 30th, the 1st, something of that nature. Because I know the 28th is going to be one of those dates. Everybody's going to be, turkeyed out, traveled out, footballed out. Probably not going to get a lot done on the 28th besides eating and cooking and watching and sleeping. The 27th could be a possibly, busy day. That's why I say if you're not really planning on trying to get a 10-page paper, if you're trying to do something less, then maybe you can be done by the 25th or the 26th. 29th, of course, is Black Friday. I don't know how many people really taking that, but that could also be a busy day. And of course, if you're traveling back, if you're flying out or something, that weekend can be kind of a busy day, busy time for you as well. But just work smarter, not harder. Uh, don't let procrastination take control because again, that's when you know your stress levels go through the roof. You're probably taking other college courses, or if you're a dual enrollment student, you got other courses at the high school. They got stuff that's going to be due, I'm sure, around the same time I do. Now after Thanksgiving, we're starting to think about Christmas. If you're working, you might be wanting to pick up additional hours so you can fund Christmas. So there's a lot of variables there that can come into play that will kind of hinder you from staying on track. So if you start early enough, this thing is doable if you start early enough and you work a little bit each day. Working a little bit each day could be 30 minutes, an hour here. If you got a little bit more time, you can get extra time in. I would probably take advantage of that. Do the hard work now. So when it gets closer to the end, you're not so rushing, stressing. Because if your stress levels get up, of course, if the weather starts changing, right, it gets colder, whatever the case may be, your system's going to be more accessible to catching anything that's going around. Flu, COVID, allergies. So if you get sick, you're definitely not going to want to do a lot. You're not wanting to go anywhere. We're not going to want you in the library if you're coughing and puking, sore throat, and having a fever. So you want to kind of keep those things in mind as we get closer to the week of our Thanksgiving break, which would start on the 25th. Technically, the college is open. We do have, if you have a Monday class or whatever, you might want to talk to your instructor about whether you're going to be having to show up for the 25th, because we don't have the whole week off like most colleges or public schools do. Technically, our break would start on the 26th and go through um, December 1st. If you want to look at it that way. So just again, work smarter, not harder. If you have any questions, please reach out. I can do a lot as it relates to guidance. I can do a lot when it deals with drafts. If you send me stuff, if you ask stuff before I actually have to sit down and grade it, because once I grade it, I mean, now it's too late, right? The whole, I didn't really understand this essay, but I went ahead and submitted it. Okay, well, where were your problems? Well, I had this, that, and everything else. Well, you also had nearly 4 weeks to get help. Did you reach out? No. Did you submit drafts to tutor.com? No. Did you ask other people in your class? No. Did you try to get help outside of class? No. Well, I mean, there's not much I can do if you're not, willing to reach out. You got to meet me halfway, um, 50-50, as they say. All right. So I hope everybody is having a good first, I guess, first full week of November here. Election day, everything is going to be kind of wild and crazy, I'm sure, as it gets closer to polls closing at 7 o'clock tonight for certain states here on the East Coast. But I hope everybody has a great rest of your week. Uh, Email me if you have any questions about the discussion post that's going to be due this week. If you want to send me drafts of your posts, I don't mind looking at drafts of your posts. Some of y'all have been sending me drafts of discussion posts and some of these weekly writings and that type stuff. And I don't mind looking at that stuff and giving you some feedback so you can get the best possible grade as possible. But just don't wait until, like, can you look at this thing and it's due in 3 hours? That's going to be hard to do. So I would say if you're going to send drafts, at least try to send them a couple of days ahead of time so that'll give me enough time to really look at them and give you some feedback. You can also send some of these, discussion post drafts to tutor.com if you want. You have a lot of different avenues to travel down to get free assistance and to help your grade be the best that it is as we head into really the last several weeks. Because if you look, we have the rest of this week, the week of the 11th, the 18th. I wouldn't really call the 25th being a week because there's really only one day. The second, so we have 1, 2, 3, count this week, 4, and there's only a little bit during the final week. So if you really look at it, we only have about a month left, give or take. So a lot of things can happen between now and the end of the semester. Your grade can continue to increase, which I hope everybody's grade does. But at the same unfortunate view there, you have 4.5 weeks that your grade can decrease each week if you're not careful. And what I mean by that is not following instructions, not turning stuff in on time, not sending drafts, not getting the help you need. Um, so you have 4 weeks to improve the grade, or you have 4 weeks to um, decrease the grade, which I hope everybody improves the grade more so than decreases. The other thing is some of y'all have taken advantage of the extra credit. I have already applied those points if you have. The other thing is, I don't know if you get the chance to look at the number 4 on the announcement page as it relates to the extra credit. I can drop one of your lowest weekly grades, meaning it can't be a major exam or a essay, but like a discussion post or like a weekly writing that wasn't too terribly long, a low stake assignment is basically what it's called. I can drop one of those, and that will help your grade out heading toward the end of the semester. Um, it may not, jump you up a letter grade here or there. That all depends on if you're already borderline, but it will kind of help. It's sort of like another form of extra credit when I drop that. So I would definitely, take the time to go through and look at some of your lowest assignments that are not, not the fiction exam, not the fiction paper, not the poetry exam, not the poetry paper. Some of these other low stake assignments. Look at the lowest one or lowest grade on the one that you have, and send me an email and let me know that's the one you want me to drop. Otherwise, as it gets closer to the 28th, if I don't hear anything from anybody, I'm probably just going to go in and I'm just going to randomly pick which one I think is the lowest and drop it for you. Because I try to give that option to all my classes. And some folks have a particular assignment they want me to drop in mine. Some of them want me to pick, but I really need to kind of know that by the 28th. The same thing with the extra credit chances. If you haven't done those, you really need to do those by the 28th as well. That way I'm not, getting a whole bunch of stuff coming in all at once and I, misplace or forget to put those points on something. And really those first three, right? You had the student survey that was worth 10 points if you did that. If you follow the instructions are on the the announcement page for that one. And you get 10 points if you complete both the pre-test and the post-test for the library orientation thing that you have to do. So in a lot of ways, I'm giving everybody the chance to make at least 20 points and drop the lowest, weekly low stake assignment. So in a lot of ways, I mean, you have nearly, I guess, about 30 points that's just out there that you can get, and I can put on the, one of these other assignments that would help your grade heading into the last month of our semester. All right, so next time I will probably talk a little bit more about a doll's house. That one may have to be broken up into two lecture videos, possibly three, depending on how I approach it. I may just focus maybe on the, act one, act two, act three type deal, or I may do one that, deals with half of that and then the other half of the play. I will see how that goes. But again, I hope everybody's doing well. I hope everybody is staying healthy. I hope your other classes are going well. Reach out if you need help. That's what I'm here to do. I'm here to help you. I can't read minds, so if you're not reaching out, I'm assuming you know what you're doing. So just please keep that in mind. The other thing is, as it relates to emails, and I sent this as an announcement and as an email a couple weeks ago. Remember, the college, when you enrolled, gave you through the Okta platform or the Okta app, Office 365 email. So you have a Coastal Pines Technical College email address. You really need to be using that when you're emailing me. If you're using Yahoo or Gmail or your high school email account or some other email account that's not associated with the college one, then chances are when you email me, because of the firewalls that the college has put up in play, I may never get it. I may get it weeks later. They usually try to block those because they don't recognize, they can't tell if that's a Coastal Pines email, legitimate email account. So that's why you don't need to be using those particular accounts. You need to use the one that the college provided for you, that student email account through the Office 365 and Okta. If you're using something else, again, chances are I may never get it. And if I do, usually I try to put, hey, use your student email account. I can't accept this. Just because the college has been getting a lot of, viruses and that type stuff from outside sources. You get bad, people trying to fish and send in Trojan viruses and worms, and we don't want to have that all through our system. So that's the whole deal. It's not me rejecting you or being rude about it. It's just that's the rule that they put on us as instructors to tell the students. So you just really need to follow those policies and guidelines as it relates to your student email account. Otherwise, I will see you probably next week with another lecture video over a doll's house. I hope you have a great rest of your week 12. And next week will be week 13. We're getting to the end here. Have a good day. Thanks.